Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Climate Talks podcast. I'm Sam Orndorff, coming to you once again from the Digital Humanities Center in the basement of Love Library here at San Diego State University. Today, I'm going to be talking about energy, its role in climate change, how it relates to fossil fuels, which we talked about last episode, and some recent trends that have happened in the United States and globally. And I'm going to be looking at a few pieces of news that you may have heard or may not have heard that really kind of bring home this issue of energy. By some measures, energy is the largest contributor to our overall greenhouse gas pollution as a humanity, as a human society. By other measures, I mean, it's really hard to put a ballpark figure on, or it's easy to put a ballpark figure on. It's hard to get down to the exacts when you're dealing with a massive global system, right? How do you measure that accurately? Well, by some measures, it would be our transportation sector that would be the biggest contributor to climate change. In the US, that's definitely the case. But if you're looking at globally, how do you kind of parse out, well, some of the transportation emissions are related to electricity and our energy system, for example, with electric vehicles. Some of the fossil fuels that you would typically associate with heating up your home and powering a power station like coal, those actually get liquefied and turn into jet fuel. So there's a lot of mixing between all of these different fossil fuel sources and the production and the processing of them into fuels, and then where does it actually get burnt, where does it actually get used. So I want you to really think about the source of that fuel, that energy, where it's being processed, where it's being shipped to, because that's a hotly contested political issue, the shipping of oil and coal and gas. And then the end product, what is it producing, which is great for people who have electricity, right? You can turn on the light switch and you have light. That's not the case for a lot of people in the Global South. A lot of people in the Global South still cook their food with just pieces of wood that they gather from whatever forest is nearby them. And so the idea of a sort of modern, in quotes, amenities or the sort of creature comforts that we associate with those sweeping changes that happened in the industrial north over like the last 100 years is really tied up not just in our idea of energy and our idea of comfort and development and progress, but it's also really wrapped up in climate change itself. Okay, so we're going to be talking about all of those today. All right, so as I said, the shipping of fossil fuels from one place to another from the site of extraction, whether it's an oil field, whether it's a coal mine, whether it's a source of gas that's liquefied and then shipped out, is a really important issue here. So if you remember about 10 years ago, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe was protesting a big pipeline that was called that is currently in use, called the Dakota Access Pipeline. So as I sort of just noted or alluded to right there, the protest against that DAPL, the DAPL, Dakota Access Pipeline, were, from the perspective of stopping the pipeline, those protests were not successful. Now, there's a significant amount of movement and momentum that helped generate. It brought people from around the world there. It really raised the issue of how frontline communities, indigenous communities, communities of color, poor communities, they are the front lines and they really feel the brunt of that extraction for fossil fuels, whether it's oil, coal, or gas. In this case, it was oil. So why were the Lakota, Dakota people in that northern Great Plains region protesting? Well, the main reason that they said is that the pipeline was going to go under one of their main sources of water, the reservoir, and it was going through their lands, which were treaty lands that the U.S. agreed to set aside for them and hold for them in trust. And it was routed through the reservation and not through Bismarck, North Dakota, which is a predominantly white town. So this is a really classic example. Communities that have been racialized or othered or treated as different because of their skin color or their culture, they feel the first and worst impacts of fossil fuel extraction. And so that pipeline was built. There were massive protests. I was sort of hoping to do my part. I was protesting in Los Angeles, where I lived at the time, to try and get the LA City Council to divest from the banks that were invested in it. So what the LA City was doing was investing retirement funds. The retirement funds of city workers and people in the area were being invested in the pipeline. And so we actually got the city council to remove that, and they divested. And it turned out a few years later that they sort of sneakily put that back in. And I would have to double check on that, but I believe that the retirement funds from a lot of public workers, from teachers, from people who just work in city governments, a lot of those retirement funds are sort of treated as capital that can then go and invest in these fossil fuel extraction and fossil fuel infrastructure and pipelines. We could just as easily be putting that investment and that energy, not actual energy, you know what I mean? Like, we could be putting that attention and we could be putting our time into investing in renewables. And so that's a really major thing here with the energy system and with transportation and with cars, public transit, all of these amenities, these services like public transit, like roads, electricity grid, they don't just materialize. They really need people to invest in them. And so for better or worse, that's one of the things that protests and social movements are able to do, is to raise the attention to the fact that the indigenous tribes are facing the brunt of the extraction. They're not really seeing the benefits, and people all over in urban areas are often unknowingly investing in these systems. So what happened with DAPL? So the tribe protested. They gathered people from around the world, and big groups got involved. So Greenpeace got involved. There were a lot of religious affiliated groups, and you saw some Buddhist monks there protesting as well in 2015 and 2016. And eventually, in the last days of his presidency, Obama sort of vetoed it, said this isn't going to happen. And then Your Man, the Orange Man, when he took office in 2017, said, okay, we're going to actually go through with this. And so that top-down authority figure just allowed it to happen. That's kind of what was the final straw, though there are a lot of moving parts. And so eventually the protest camp sort of dissipated. People went back to their homes, kind of went back to the drawing board to re-strategize, how do we deal with this now that it's being constructed. One of the things that happened in the fallout, and you may have heard this in the news, is that Greenpeace, which is a nonviolent organization that is, obviously peace is in their name, right? They helped to raise the profile of this issue. They gathered signatures. They had people out there on the ground. They were doing a lot of communications to raise awareness. But the Energy Transfer Partners company, the oil company that is doing this pipeline, actually sued Greenpeace recently. And so what could they possibly sue them for? Well, here is their argument. They said that Greenpeace was an outside organization that was bringing in protesters and harming the company's ability to make a profit off of this oil, and they were sued for over $600 million in damages and lost profit that the oil company, Energy Transfer Partners, was claiming Greenpeace is responsible for them losing this profit because they were helping to organize the protests. So what that is, that's actually called, there's a term for that. This is called a SLAPP suit, and it stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. So what is that? That's really just mostly a phony case that's designed to threaten and repress free speech against powerful corporations and other actors who have a lot of power and money, and they have a lot of sway. They use these SLAPP lawsuits to really just threaten and scare off different civil society organizations. And it's not just left-leaning organizations or environmental organizations. There are a lot of different organizations that have faced a SLAPP lawsuit as a way to get them to just back off and stop using their free speech. Now, it's a major, major issue here. And where you have your court case is also really important too, if you get into the legal geography. So some of our district courts in the United States are more left-leaning than others. Some are more right-leaning. And Energy Transfer Partners, when they sued Greenpeace, claiming that their protests and their contributions at Standing Rock were undermining their ability to make money, they were able to get that lawsuit seen in a court in North Dakota, I believe, which is going to be more conservative than other parts of the country. What happened? Well, the oil company sued the environmental organization, saying that the environmentalists slandered them, and they won. Okay? Energy Transfer Partners won the lawsuit that was claiming that Greenpeace was lying. They were bringing in protesters. They were harming their ability to make profit. Greenpeace wasn't doing anything but stating facts. Okay? The oil company now is going to be paid up to $660 million. So activists who do this oftentimes as just part of their daily life, it's not their main job. They do it because they care about this community at Standing Rock. They do it because they care about the environment. They want people to use less fossil fuels. The activists in Greenpeace have to now pay up $660 million to an oil company for the profits that the oil company says they lost out on due to the protests. So an environmental organization is supposed to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to an oil company because the oil company is claiming that they hurt their profits. It's completely warped. It's completely illogical. And there will be some appeals, I'm sure, and we'll see how those play out. But it's a really scary precedent, especially for people who are out there protesting and people who work in Greenpeace. So that's really concerning because you want to be able to use your voice to say things that are critical of a company, but if you can demonstrate that they're true, if you can make an appeal to people's ethics, their sense of right and wrong, that should be well within your freedoms as a person with constitutional protection, right? First Amendment, the right to free speech. Where's that going? I'm a little bit concerned about that. And meanwhile, just taking a sip of coffee. Meanwhile, the Dakota Access Pipeline is up and running, okay? It's been pumping out fuel. It's already leaked a couple of times, exactly as the activists said it would. The land protectors, the water protectors, they said this thing was going to leak, and that's exactly what it did. I mean, how could it not, right? It's a hundreds of miles long pipeline pumping oil from the western part of the country down towards the south, towards the southeast, to be processed, to be sent to other places. It's just the nature of the infrastructure. It's the nature of the thing to have a leak, right? It's a giant pipe going across the land, going across water that people use for drinking and for agriculture. And so that's one of the good things that you see. One of the good things that came out of this is that there are different actors that you might not necessarily imagine as being allied who really are. So a lot of ranchers, a lot of farmers, a lot of people out there in the countryside who were not indigenous came to support the tribe and said that this is going to harm our farms and ranches as well, so we should be against it. And you don't really see that as much out there. It's really, the image you have probably in your head of somebody who's protesting for climate change is probably a young person. It's sort of, they don't want us to be able to find allies. They don't want us to feel comfortable using our free speech. And so that's why these big, powerful energy companies and oil companies are suing organizations like Greenpeace to get people to shut up. And the thing is we're not going to shut up. Let me give you another example of the energy system that we've got, some of the tentacles that it has reaching into other areas of our life. So you may remember when I interviewed Judy on this podcast, episode 5, we talked about agriculture. I sort of took went off on a tangent just to talk about the role of the chemical industry, how a lot of those chemicals were really byproducts of our wars, and they were experimentally used and tested in the form of pesticide and herbicide. That herbicide that I noted, which is Agent Orange, It was used in the Korean War in the 1950s. It was used in the war in Vietnam when the United States invaded Vietnam to try and stop the spread of communism. That's where Agent Orange was used as a defoliant to sort of destroy entire forest canopies in order to be able to find the rebel groups who are defending their homeland. One of the companies that created Agent Orange is probably a company that you've heard of. They're called Monsanto. And they actually got bought out a few years ago by Bayer, this big German drug corporation. And they are really wrapped up in this, not just the chemical industry, not just the fossil fuel industry, but like I said, the sort of military-industrial complex that is very deeply wedded to the energy system, to the consumption, the acquisition, and the control and the capture of fossil fuels. So why did I bring up Monsanto? Recently, it was discovered after the UK newspaper, The Guardian, did an investigation that Monsanto executives had an entire social media sort of network that profiled anti-pesticide and anti-herbicide activists and scholars. And they used so it was actually not Monsanto, I should say. It was a person who worked at Monsanto as a PR person, eventually left, was very familiar with Monsanto and this mega giant chemical agricultural corporation. And he went on to start this other organization that was basically like a sort of off-the-radar social media site that had profiles unbeknownst to the activists, to the scholars, to the public figures who were working against pesticides, saying they're harmful to workers, they are harmful to our agriculture system, they're harmful to the ecology because a lot of pesticides and herbicides are potentially very harmful. People were making those legitimate claims. Meanwhile, this ex-Monsanto executive is collecting their information, collecting their home address, information about them, their family members, the names of them, of their kids and their families and their address, etc., and their phone number, and making that available to industry actors. And so what happened is the Guardian somehow got word of this, began to investigate, and then the people who were running this social media site that was really just meant to scare off activists who are trying to get the agriculture system to be more organic, to be more humanized and more ethical and less so dependent on chemicals, which is a really powerful branch of the fossil fuel industry. So The Guardian investigated them, found out that this social media site just exists out there under the radar. I believe they got access to it, and I'll link to the article that came out a few weeks ago in our description here. Yeah, so The Guardian found that out, really took them to task, and I believe that website got shut down, that social media site. I probably don't have a big enough profile to be on that, but sorry, I'm taking a sip of coffee. I probably don't have a big enough profile to be on that, but I would count myself against pesticides, herbicides, and fossil fuel derives fertilizers. These are all really, there's a lot of pressure for people who grow food, not just in the United States, but especially in the global South, to take up these things. Sometimes people will go into debt. And it's a really kind of wicked system because once you start investing in these inputs, not only do you go in debt, but a lot of the seeds are designed to be used with the herbicides and pesticides, and some of those seeds will not go on to produce new seeds. So they've designed crops to be able to put people in debt and be these commodities, not these delicious, nutritious, culturally important things that people have passed down literally from hand to hand for forever. For as long as there have been humans, people have been passing down seeds and trying to get by without using too many inputs. And the chemicals industry and Monsanto, they want people to be spending money on their products. And they do all kinds of other fucked up things that you should really look into if you get a chance. And so why do I bring up the Dakota Access Pipeline? Why do I bring up Monsanto? It's because I really want to highlight for the listeners how embedded fossil fuels are in our energy system, in our idea of electricity, our usage of electricity, the way we cook food, the way we grow food. All of these things are really wrapped up in fossil fuels. And when it comes to actual energy production, that's actually a really kind of nebulous concept when you get into it. There are a lot of social scientists who would tell you that these abstract nouns that we say all the time and don't really give much thought to, well, they're actually really complex ideas that are really hard to pin down when it comes to actually looking at them, such as culture, such as the environment. Energy is just like that. Like, what is it actually? Because we say this term to sort of be equivalent to, like Pop Smoke says, energy. I'm giving nothing but energy. Right? So energy is, it's a nebulous idea. It includes a range of different concepts. It deals with physics, right? And conservation of energy and atrophy and the overall system that we're in the universe is sort of a form of energy, and it's slowly dying out over time, just like the sun is. But energy has actually been investigated by Kara New Daggett in her book that deals a lot with the concept of energy. And really what you see in the last century or so is the equivalence between energy and electricity. And so energy can mean a lot of different things, and we should still keep it open to interpretation. But when you see it being uttered from the mouths of fossil fuel actors, they will often combine energy with national security, or they will combine energy with freedom, or they will combine cheap energy with this idea that you're independent and that if you have energy that is cheap, then you're actually doing something that's good for the environment. So it's a really complicated idea that fits a lot of different concepts within it. But when I'm talking about energy, and I think when a lot of energy justice advocates, climate justice advocates are engaging with the idea of energy, really what we're looking at is the burning of coal, oil, and gas to create electricity that's used in the grid, to power our homes, to electrify our homes. If you turn on a light switch, that's the energy we're talking about. If you use air conditioning, that's the energy we're talking about, right? And so energy in the United States, 3/4 of the energy in the United States comes from burning fossil fuels. About 20% of that is just from burning coal. Now, coal, as I've discussed, comes in several different forms. The coal, the availability of it in the United States, in England, and in other places like in Germany, really helped to give them a leg up in terms of their economic development. They were burning coal to power people's homes, to heat up people's homes in the winter. Coal is actually really important in the production of steel because it burns at a really high temperature that allows you to sort of mold and modify all of these different ores and metals to turn different things into steel, iron ore. And so coal has been really important in that. It's actually been declining in the United States and globally, which is a great thing because so much energy, so much electricity has been produced by coal. And one of the byproducts, as I mentioned, is sulfur dioxide. When sulfur dioxide is in the atmosphere, it reacts with rain, it becomes acidic. That is how you get acid rain. You don't want acid raining down from the skies. Turns out that's actually pretty bad. So coal has been really important. Petroleum has been the big one for the last 150 years. And really, you see in the last 20 years is this quest for liquid natural gas. So gas that's being pumped out a lot of times in the same exact sites of oil. You're able to pump out gas there and liquefy it and ship it around. Now, there are other forms of energy and electrification that go back as far as coal and actually came online before the fossil fuels. So, for example, if you look at the history of hydroelectric power in the United States, big hydroelectric dams have a lot of impacts on the aquatic ecosystem. They prevent fish from moving around. They raise the temperature of the water. They decrease the quality of the water in the reservoir. They accumulate toxins in the reservoir, and they inundate entire riparian ecosystems along the streams. But once you plug up the river, you create this pressure point, and usually it should be high in elevation. That water goes down a chute, spins a turbine, generates electricity. So that technology is pretty old. It came online in the late 1800s. And in a lot of places places like Washington and Michigan, they had hydroelectric power before they had other forms of power. And it's often been said that getting that electricity to homes using hydropower dams helped to raise the literacy levels, because previously people would just use candles or little oil lamps at nighttime to light up their homes, or they would just go to bed early. But with the advent of hydroelectric power and homes becoming electrified and lit up at night, people were able to study with their children, help them read and write and learn more. Now, back east in New York City, when coal was becoming more and more popular, so the Appalachians, not too far away from the Atlantic seaboard, initially they were actually giving coal to individual consumers directly. They would market it. They would tell you, here's what you can do with coal. You can burn it in a little furnace to heat up your house, to cook food. When you do that, it's horrible for the air in your home. That coal, you do not want to be burning that in a closed area. And so that didn't really take off. What did take off is this centralized heating system where coal would be burnt at a central location somewhere in the city, and then the steam that it would heat up water, and that steam would be piped through pipes around New York City, and then that would have its endpoint in people's homes, and it would be steam heating up the homes. And so that was one of the early instances where you saw the centralized form of heating from fossil fuels that was being distributed from one point, and that one point would have its own issues with pollution and everything. But at the very least, it was providing an opportunity for people to heat up their homes without worrying too much about their actual indoor air quality. There are other forms of energy that are seen as increasingly important. So you have nuclear power. Is considered to be low impact but high risk. So you see Fukushima and Daiichi, 3 Mile Island. A lot of nuclear reactors, when they have a failure, it can be really catastrophic. Obviously, Chernobyl is a big one. And you don't want that to happen. So the nuclear power generator, it's not burning fossil fuels. It's a nuclear reaction that heats up water, that turns a turbine, and that generates electricity. As I said previously, so all of our forms of energy are really just heating up water and spinning into steam and heating up a turbine, heating up steam that will turn a turbine and generate power. We haven't really figured out a different way to do that. Nuclear is dangerous because the water that it heats up is radioactive. It's toxic in a very extreme way. You don't want to touch it. You don't want to play with it. And it's got a half-life of 10,000 years. So you've produced all of this electricity at the nuclear power station without burning fossil fuels, but you have a bunch of these big tanks of water that's radioactive. That's it's like basically radioactive waste, and we don't have a barrel that can store radioactive, decommissioned radioactive waste for 10,000 years. It doesn't exist. All of our storage facilities that are proposed for nuclear are all temporary. There isn't a permanent solution for dealing with that. And nuclear, because it's very high tech and it's also very high risk, and it's something you have to think about over the long term. There's been a really complicated story there in the United States and around the world in terms of who's for it and who's against it. And so I think typically most environmentalists will be for it because it doesn't produce CO2 and these other nasty greenhouse gases. But the question remains is how we're going to store that. And so one of the proposals in the United States was to ship all of our nuclear waste from all of our nuclear power stations into Yucca Mountain. It is on the Shoshone homelands, southern Paiute homelands in southern Nevada. And once again, you see indigenous communities having one of their sacred landscapes, their sacred mountains, being sacrificed. And that's been in the news. That's been a struggle for my entire lifetime. And they still haven't figured out a way to get everybody on board to say, this is where we're going to store our nuclear waste, deep under this mountain. It's a really thorny problem. But nuclear only comprises about, a few percentage of our overall energy portfolio in the United States. Hydropower is a pretty sizable chunk there as well. You got to really consider what are going to be the impacts of climate change on hydropower, because a lot of these rivers are starting to get a lot more dry. A lot of these big dams that we built 100 years ago are very old and they're aging. Concrete does not last as long as you might think. Dams really only last about 80 years. So a lot of hydroelectric and just regular non-hydropower, but just major dams are going to be up for either renewal or removal here soon. You also have other energy sources in our portfolio too. So what would those be? Those would be solar. Those would be wind. Those would be geothermal. You also have waves or offshore or ocean energy. The one I want to talk about is the other half. So if you add up all of our quote unquote renewables, those only make up about 25% in the United States of our total energy generation, which is good. And you also have to think about where is the energy being produced? Is it being used locally or not? And so in some cases, actually, they're producing too much energy. They might have like a solar panel farm or a massive network of wind turbines that the energy grid is not designed for them to just ship the energy wherever, to just send that electricity wherever it's needed. It's not set up for that. It's set up to be used locally. And sometimes, they'll actually not be able to use that electricity. That's just the reality of the grid. So you really have to think about all of these different forms of energy. Where are they coming from? How are they regulated? How are they discussed? Are we investing in renewables? In many cases, not enough. What the United States has actually been doing for the last couple decades is this all of the above approach. You see it under every major president. Actually, I would even include both Trump administrations as well. Although he's vocally opposed to renewables, he thinks that wind turbines cause ear cancer. But the United States has this all of the above approach where they continually invest in all forms of energy extraction, production, transportation, shipping the energy everywhere, getting it however we want, from fracking, from bitumen, from coal mining, from all of the above, right? Including renewables. That's not really worked too great because of all the things that I've been talking about, and also because our energy demand keeps growing and growing and growing. It's like a cancerous tumor. The more and more that we get renewables online, the more and more our energy demand goes up and up and up. So what's causing the increase in energy? Well, look at a city at night. Do all those buildings need to have every single light on in every single room? Probably not. Look at big data centers. Look at the development of artificial intelligence and how much electricity it's using, how much water it's using to cool off those data centers where those machines and those supercomputers get really, really hot and they bring in water to cool off those computers. And they demand a lot of electricity. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the UN, all of these international agreements have in them the idea that we will use less, consume less energy, and produce more renewable energy. But that's just not what's happening because we keep every gain that's made with more renewables is basically undermined by more and more energy demand. That's a huge, huge problem. Now, if we were reducing our demand of energy and putting more and more renewables into the system, then we would be making progress, but we haven't been. And what it really boils down to, as I've mentioned multiple times, is investment. Where are your priorities? Are your priorities in getting more oil out there, more fossil fuels? Is the priority to use public lands to drill oil? Or is the priority to do whatever it takes to get a more clean energy system, an energy system that doesn't have source point pollution like that coal station that is almost always going to be next to a poor community or a community of color? Communities are going to have tough decisions where they have this beautiful landscape. They may not necessarily want wind turbines up there. It's going to completely change the look of it, right? But obviously, most people are well educated enough to know that that's going to have a lot of benefits down the line. And so that's a tough choice that you're going to have to make. Now, compare that to the ecocidal destruction that is witnessed by fossil fuel extraction in places like the Bakken crude oil fields. And I think it's a pretty easy choice when you put it like that, right? But the United States right now, under the current EPA, the Department of Interior, and the Department of Energy, has really been pushing this idea that we need to be independent. Our energy system should be independent. Now, that's not really the case. We've been importing oil for a really long time, almost about 100 years. We've been importing oil, like a huge chunk of it, right? We went to Iraq to set up oil contracts for the US and the UK oil companies like British Petroleum, BP, right? That's why we went there. And now they're having this sort of dialogue about, well, why don't we just use US lands, federal lands, could even be national parks or forest reserves, dig up the oil that's there and we'll be, quote, energy independent. You see that happening just in the last few months. Now, the head of the Department of Energy used to work in fracking. He recently, just a few days ago, went out to Colorado. He was basically saying that climate change alarmism has hurt the industry and it has hurt our independence of our energy. One of the quotes he said is, quote, "The biggest barrier in energy development the last few decades is people, for political reasons, calling climate change a crisis," unquote. He said that climate alarmism led to policies that curtailed American infrastructure and may not actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Okay? So what they're doing is trying to say that there's an industry and there's an alarm bell that's ringing that's not necessary. We should just keep digging up fossil fuels. That is definitely concerning for the fact that we want to stop digging up so much oil. We want to stop shipping it around the world, right? And also it's alarming because they don't take seriously the threats that are posed by continual burning of fossil fuels. The vast majority of the CO2 emissions that are out there, like well over 90%, have come from burning fossil fuels. So there are these other sources of pollution, like when you cut down a forest, when you fill in a wetland and you develop it and you pave it over, and you set up homes. Those do contribute to the problem of climate change. They do contribute emissions, but nowhere near as much as burning fossil fuels. So if we really want to refine and distill our critique of the system that is causing climate change, we have to look at the burning of fossil fuels, okay? Now, I wanted to get to a couple of questions that were sent in by a listener, and I love getting listener questions. It's very exciting. I've been hoping to hear from you, the listener. And so I got some questions here. This is from Colin in Richmond, Virginia. That is the hometown of one of my favorite musicians, one of the greatest musicians, D'Angelo. He's from Richmond, Virginia. Okay, Colin has asked me a couple questions, and I did respond. Colin had asked about books that I would recommend for climate change to really wrap your head around the social side of this, the political side, or the environmental side. And so the books that I recommended are The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh, Climate Leviathan by Joel Wainwright and Jeff Mann, and Under a White Sky, which is by Elizabeth Kolbert, is a good sort of everyday, in layman's terms, a book. And then that book that I did recommend is Kara New Daggett. That book is called The Birth of Energy. And so the questions that Colin asked again, we had a good back and forth, are, I think, really relevant, and they speak to what I'm trying to talk to today in terms of our energy system and the progress that's been made. All right, so the first question, what is our progress in trying to keep the increase in the average global temperature to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, if that is the goal? And aren't we close to exceeding that? What should we expect in the next, let's say, immediate time frame after 2030? And so I had to Google this, and what I thought was correct, there is no progress. So we have already surpassed that 1.5 degrees Celsius global average increase in temperature since pre-industrial levels. We've already surpassed that. We're at 1.55. So there's no progress in keeping the average global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is because by most accepted measures, that metric has been surpassed in the last about year. So what we can expect now, what I think, is that the international system is going to start rehashing the debate about what a safe level of increase is. So this was already hotly contested just to reach a general consensus that 1.5 degrees was a safe amount of change in the first place. And I think that the major reason that humanity has, as a whole, has not hit that goal is just simply put because ever increasing emissions, and that's really just the basic fact at play. Any renewables that get added to the energy grid or transportation systems are pretty much immediately undermined or rendered ineffective by increased greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere. The increased use of AI and computational data have massive energy requirements. By some measures, they have already neutralized entire regions' worth of solar or wind power. All right, so what I would predict in the next 5 years, we will likely see a lot of mental gymnastics to sort of fudge the numbers, overcommitments by major countries, especially in the global north, that they're going to reduce their emissions without putting in much effort. They're going to make those commitments. In terms of the actual climate itself, what are you going to see in the next 5 years? Increasing volatility. That's what you're going to see. You're going to see more extreme weather more often. So that includes hot, that includes cold, that includes wet, that includes dry, right? Generally speaking, in the arid and semi-arid western part of North America, less rain. And then in the eastern, more mesic, sort of east of the Mississippi, that 100th meridian, you're going to see more flooding, more extreme weather. You're going to see hot, weird temperatures in the winter and possibly cold, weird temperatures in the summer. And then polar regions are going to be warming at the fastest rate. That is well known. Another question. Internationally, what should we do when historically underdeveloped countries seek to industrialize soon? And then in parentheses, Colin wrote, it's not fair if they can't, but doesn't help climate change if they do. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Talking about the equity here, equality of these poor countries have contributed a teeny tiny amount to the overall pollution that's out there. The general assumption is that for a country to develop, it is going to just depend on fossil fuels. It's going to depend on industry. It's going to burn fuel to develop to a point where people have power in their homes and they don't have to go out and get wood to cook their food. That leap is generally assumed to require fossil fuels. I don't know if that's always the case. You can actually leapfrog. A lot of technologies are able to be leapfrogged and hopefully burn less. But here's the answer that I sent to Colin in an email. So yes, in general, the less developed countries will burn fossil fuels to develop their economy. Some countries, especially in key regions and cities, are trying to do it differently by investing in green technology. But it's very nuanced once you get beyond the numbers, since a lot of countries, like Norway and England, are very proud of increasing their economic output without increasing emissions. However, their emissions often get, quote, exported, unquote, or hidden by the measurement system. For example, Norway extracts fossil fuels and ships them to less developed places, and the less developed places get credited for burning the fuel and polluting, not Norway. And so another book that I recommended is checking out Adrienne Buller's book, The Value of a Whale, on the Illusions of Green Capitalism. And she really looks at the way that these different emissions are accounted for and who's deemed responsible, which country. And so there really aren't many examples of, quote, green growth, or what some experts call decoupled emissions and economic output. You're supposed to decouple the growth of the economy without burning more fossil fuel. Is it even possible to have economic growth when we have multi-million dollars in damage from one storm in one city, and that's happening multiple times in a year? Is it possible to have economic growth when the natural world and the climate system that's been relatively stable is starting to break down? So I think we should really critique this idea that the economy is somehow separate from the natural world. That's a farce. I think people are slowly waking up to that, and that's what I responded to that question with. And I think that if we accounted for the many benefits of intact, healthy ecosystems, like wetlands, like peat bogs, which I often go back to, simply not disturbing them would be both economic and environmental, right? Wetlands, whether they're coastal, whether they're inland, whether they're saline or not, wetlands are really good at absorbing floods, so they reduce the damage of big storms. They really act like sponges that suck up that excess water, and that has a measurable cost. And they have all these other benefits to humans and more than humans and their homes for plants and animals. So you can put a value on that. But really, this question has a lot of debate going on in academic circles, and it's not really settled. It's not really clear-cut. But most elite people, most people in high positions of power with a lot of capital, with a lot of cachet, business people in every country, both poor and wealthy, they continue to invest in fossil fuels because on paper, fossil fuels are less risky. This idea is still out there that if you invest in fossil fuels, somebody's going to need it and burn it. That's called inelastic in demand. That's what I was taught when I studied economics and economic development. So we have to challenge that because a lot of the renewable energy sources are not just cheaper than fossil fuels, but they aren't risky because people are going to need them. And if you have a major windstorm that knocks out a couple, it might knock out a couple of wind turbines for a little bit, but how is that really different from a coal plant having some kind of damage from a major storm? Right? There's risk involved in everything. So we have to get rid of this idea that fossil fuels are a necessity for an economy. That's not the case. And then Colin also asked climate consciousness. Let's talk about that. What can individuals do in their daily life and at the community level to lessen their carbon footprint? That's an awesome question, Colin. I'm so glad you're thinking about this. And some of the ideas that I have are to eat less meat, grow your own food, buy locally made things, shop at farmers market, don't buy a ton of unnecessary stuff. If you can, if you're able, use transit, walk, bike, skate, scooter, take a pogo stick. Don't burn fuels for fun. Don't go riding on a jet ski. Don't go driving around for no reason. And I think one of the biggest individual actions you can take is to not really drive or fly. Use mass transit and vocally support it. Go out there and support. I know it's bad. I know there's reasons that we'll get into in a later episode as to why public transit is so bad here. It used to be great, but there was a forced conversion of everybody's movement from mass transit into individualized auto mobility, and that's a huge problem. So we have to start investing, supporting, and being vocally in favor of mass transit, public transit. And I'm pretty sure if you look wherever you are, there's almost everywhere in the United States, in almost every region, there is some kind of fossil fuel extraction, processing, or shipment happening. So oppose that. All right, that's one strategy. If you're going to grow food, like I mentioned, grow some native plants. Pick up some litter, so more plants and animals have a chance to have a normal, healthy environment. And I think just talking about it goes a long way. Share your love of nature. Be a champion of an endangered species, right? You have all these people out there wearing clothes with logos, and everybody recognizes the logo, but could they recognize a plant that's endangered or the shape of a leaf? So brands get this visibility, and they have this investment, and people work for them, and they literally get paid by them, and they're almost like a person, like a living entity. But we have actual living entities that are on the brink and that are threatened, and we should give them a voice, put them on a shirt. Another tip I have is don't work for an oil company or a gas company or a coal company, no matter how much they pay you. But I think one of the things we really have to do is think in baby steps. We did not get to where we are today in big, massive overhauls that happened overnight. Rome wasn't built in a day, as my mom would often say. And what we're talking about is shaping the culture to be more pro-environmental. And that, I think, comes down to just taking back your agency. There's so much that you can do. It's not as if there's nothing you can do, right? And so I think it's important that people stop being complacent. Stop acting like it's all just up to the politicians. It's all about corporations. You know, they're responsible. It's a systemic issue. Well, I'm just one person. That's complacent, right? That's too easy. That's a cop-out. There are things you can do in your daily life. And so we have to challenge that fatalistic notion that there's nothing we can do. It's a really harmful idea. It's all about education. It's all about shaping the culture one baby step at a time. And so last, this is the big news. We here at the Climate Talks team are going to be having a Climate Talks live podcast. We are so excited to do this. This is a continuation of the Climate Talks series that the Geography Graduate Student Association has been putting on since 2021. So this is actually our 5th annual Climate Talks live event. And we're going to have 2 experts coming on to the stage at this live recording. So we're going to be discussing with them. Hopefully you guys can send us in some questions that I can ask them. So what we have is we have an ecologist, a botanist who specializes in plant microbe interactions in the context of climate change. We have a paleoclimatologist / paleooceanographer who looks at the last 10,000 years of climate change and uses really interesting methods to understand how climate has changed in that time period. And so please, if you have a question for them, go ahead and send it to us at climatetalksquestion@gmail.com. And if you're in the San Diego area, if you're an SDSU student, please come down to the Digital Humanities Center and come and check out the live event. That's going to be on Monday, April 28th at 5 to 7 p.m. roughly. And we are going to have some refreshments and libations in the afterward. So please come and join us on April 28th at 5 o'clock down here at the DHC. We're going to be doing this Climate Talks live event. And if you have a question, you can go ahead and send it to us. That's going to be it for me. And I'll see you next time, my love.